Hi everyone, so this is Lecture 1, Introduction to Biology, based on the Concepts of Biology Open Education Resource Textbook, Chapter 1. So hopefully by the end of this lecture, you will be able to identify and describe the properties of life, describe the levels of organization among living things, and list examples of different subdisciplines in biology. So biology is the science that studies life. What exactly is life? So not everything that is in nature is alive, and on the other flip side, there are more things than we think of that are alive that we can study. So what is life? So are viruses alive? Technically, although we kind of lump viruses and bacteria together because they both make people sick, they are not alive. Bacteria are alive, but viruses are not alive. So although viruses can attack living organisms and cause diseases, they don't meet the criteria that biologists use to define life. So then what is life? How are viruses alive, or not alive, but bacteria are alive? So that's one of the things we want to clarify here. So how other things that biologists ponder. So what is alive? And then how do various living things function? How do we organize the different kinds of organisms so that we could better understand them? How did this diversity arise and how is it continuing? So this is all stuff that biologists study. So first off, what is alive? So these are characteristics that all things that are alive will share. So all groups of living organisms share 8 characteristics. So first off, to the right, I included pictures of various different organisms that are alive. So some we might think of as for sure alive, like whales and pandas and things like that. But even snails, beetles, and the very topmost bacteria, so bacteria that live, in our environment, are alive. So what makes these things alive? These 8 characteristics: order, sensitivity or response to stimuli, reproduction, adaptation, growth and development, regulation or homeostasis, energy processing, and evolution. And so we will go into more detail on each one in the following slides. But these are things that we use. Say you discover a new organism or some new thing and you're trying to figure out, well, is it alive? You would kind of use this as a checklist. So let's go through with number 1, order. So organisms are highly organized structures that consist of one or more cells. So even though bacteria are very, very tiny and simple, they are very complex. So there's a whole subfield that studies just bacteria called microbiology. So even though that they are very, very simple and microscopic, they are alive because they meet some of the rest of these characteristics, but they are very complex. They have a lot of order to them. And of course, other organisms that are multicellular, they're made of millions of cells. They're kind of obviously, alive because they are made of so many different things like cells and tissues, organs. So multicellular organisms can have millions of individual cells. And this is kind of an advantage over single-celled organisms because they can have cells that are specialized to do different functions. So for example, one cell, one bacteria is one organism. So they're very, very simple, but also, still complex. Versus other organisms, like humans, of course, were made of millions of cells that make up the one organism. So for example, here's a toad. It's a highly organized structure consisting of cells that work together to form tissues, and those work together to form organs, and those work together to form organ systems. So yeah, there's a lot of order when it comes to living organisms. Characteristic number 2 is sensitivity or response to stimuli. So organisms respond to stimuli in their environment. So either internal or external. There are things going on that any organism that's living will experience around it. So we call those stimuli. That's something that will trigger a response. So organisms respond to many diverse stimuli. So for example, there are plants that if you've ever seen like kind of like a palm tree or a sunflower, there are plants that can kind of bend and grow towards a light source, or there are even some plants that respond to touch. So in this next slide is a quick picture. So this is a plant called Mimosa pudica, which will droop and fold when touched. So if you like touch it, it will actually kind of like move in response. So that is response to a stimuli, like you tapping it. But even tiny bacteria can move toward or away from chemicals or light. So yeah, things that we might not even think of that we think might not be responding to their environment, like they can in a lot of cases. So characteristic number 3, reproduction. So something that is alive has to be able to make more of its own kind somehow. So for example, bacteria, they just kind of duplicate their DNA and then split into two new cells. So single-celled organisms reproduce by first duplicating their DNA, then dividing it equally as the cell prepares to divide, and then forms 2 new cells. So bacteria, that's how easy it is for them to reproduce. They just like kind of double up on everything and then split into 2. Reproduction for bigger multicellular organisms is kind of more complex. They usually produce specialized reproductive cells that will then end up forming new individuals. So when the reproduction occurs, you know, it's an organism and they have specialized cells that are in charge of just reproduction. And so in those specialized cells, DNA containing genes is divided and passed along to the organism's offspring. And then that cell will get fertilized in a lot of cases of like sexual reproduction will get fertilized, and then those cells will start dividing to become a new organism. So yeah, a living organism has to be able to reproduce on its own to be considered living. So for example, bacteria, they for sure do that, but this is a reason that viruses are not alive. They can't reproduce on their own, and they're actually not even like cells. So a virus is kind of just like a shell. It's like a protein shell with just DNA inside. So even though we kind of show it in visual representations like a circle with stuff inside, and that kind of looks like how we also represent cells, they're not the same. So viruses don't have the same kind of order. They don't have cells. They're not made of the stuff that makes cells, and they can't reproduce on their own. So viruses have to be taken in by a living organism, and then they infect your cells, and they kind of like hijack your cells and force your cells to make more of that kind of virus. So that's why viruses technically don't reproduce on their own. They have to have a living cell reproduce more virus for them. So yeah, that's one reason that viruses are not alive. But bacteria are. Bacteria are living organisms because they're made of a cell that can reproduce on their own. So characteristic number 4 of things that are alive, adaptation. So all living organisms kind of exhibit a fit to their environment. You'll notice different plants and animals that seem pretty well suited to their environment, and that's because of a long time of evolution by natural selection, and just this long process of things that are better suited to their environment will be the ones that survive and carry on their genes. So that's how over time organisms seem like they're really well fit to their environment, because nature has selected the ones that are kind of best suited to that environment. Yeah, so we refer to that as adaptation when it's actually like very well suited to its environment. Number 5, growth and development. So organisms, to be alive, organisms have to be able to grow and develop according to specific instructions coded by their genes. So genes are basically like an instruction manual. They provide instructions that direct cellular growth and development, ensuring that a species young will grow up to show many of the same characteristics as its parents. So even though bacteria I'm sorry, even though viruses do technically have some genes, again, they don't grow on their own. They don't grow and then develop into anything. They're kind of just stuff, basically. And so they don't grow and develop even though they have some kind of genetic instructions. That's what it uses to trick your cells into making more of itself. But other things, other living things, they have DNA and they have the genes that are the instructions like, hey, you're going to become a new kitten. So yeah, these kittens have genes that they inherited from their parents, and many of them share the same characteristics, and some of them might look different because they have, they express more of the genes from one parent versus the other one. But yeah, these carry on. This is an example of an organism that carries on inherited genetic material that ends up coding and telling these cells to become these kinds of cats. So characteristic number 6 is regulation or homeostasis. So even the smallest, tiniest organisms like bacteria are complex and require multiple regulatory mechanisms to coordinate internal functions. So even though they're very small and simple, bacteria still have a lot of things to be able to adapt to and respond to. So they also provide what's called homeostasis. So homeostasis is the relatively stable internal environment required to maintain life. So throughout any organism's life, it's going to experience multiple different conditions and environments. And so you have to have a way to kind of have internal regulation to kind of keep going and make sure that you're going to be fine. So for example, well, I guess I'll get to the other example in the next slide. But in this example, organ systems like your digestive system or your circulatory system, so carrying your blood that carries oxygen throughout the body. It removes waste, delivers nutrients to every cell, and cools the body. So all this stuff works together to make sure that you, as an organism, have a relatively stable internal environment, so that you can, maintain your life. So organisms can maintain this homeostasis internal condition within a narrow range pretty consistently. So for example, our body, we have an average body temperature of 98.6, and that's pretty good. So that shows that our body is really good at maintaining that pretty stable, constant temperature despite all the heat outside right now. So yeah, for example, regulating body temperature through thermoregulation, that's one pretty clear example of homeostasis, how your body has to kind of work to maintain that core body temperature and not have it go too high or too low despite us being in constant different environmental conditions. So another example is polar bears and other mammals that live in ice-covered regions. They are able to maintain a core temperature and not have a core temperature of, almost freezing. They have a lot of stuff going on internally that helps them maintain their body temperature by making heat and reducing heat loss through their fur and fat under their skin. So that is an example of thermoregulation to maintain homeostasis. Characteristic number 7 of living things is energy processing. So to be able to do all the things that living things need to do, to divide and grow and develop and maintain homeostasis, it takes energy. So all living organisms use a source of energy for their metabolic activities. Some organisms can capture energy from the sun and convert it into chemical energy in food. So those we would call autotrophs, so plants. And there are other kinds of simple organisms that can do that too, but the main group that does this is plants that are autotrophs. They're able to basically make their own energy just from converting the sunlight into chemical energy so that they can keep living. That's why you have to make sure if you have houseplants that they have access to enough light that kind of plant requires, because the light is necessary for their energy. Meanwhile, other organisms use chemical energy from molecules that they take in from other organisms usually. So those we would call heterotrophs. So that includes us. Like, we have to eat something else, and that's how we get our energy. So we, humans, are heterotrophs. Yeah. So here's an example. Here's a California condor. It takes a lot of energy to be able to fly. These guys are huge, and it takes energy to do that huge wingspan and fly long distances. So yeah, it takes energy. And again, this is another way that viruses are not alive, because they don't grow and develop, and they don't reproduce on their own, and they don't have all the stuff that makes them a cell. They don't process energy at all. You can just have a virus cell living on the surface of something for a long time, but it's not living. It's just kind of existing, and that's also part of why we stressed so much cleaning surfaces and things like that during the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdown, because they don't require energy. They won't just like die because they weren't living to begin with. They're just kind of stuff that will stay there, if that makes sense. But bacteria, they are alive. They do a bunch of stuff. They have to consume nutrients and things like that through some source. And so lastly, the characteristic of living things is evolution. So the diversity of life on Earth is possible and is a result of mutations or random changes in genetic material over time. So it's a long time of basically lots of tiny little mistakes being made, and that mistake led to something that led this organism to be able to keep living and reproducing and pass on its hereditary material. So over time, this leads to changes. So these mutations allow the possibility for organisms to adapt to a changing environment, and an organism that evolves characteristics fit for that environment will have greater reproductive success. So they'll be the ones that will be able to live longer and then pass on their genes because of natural selection. So we will get to a kind of cool lab where we'll kind of get to act this out. So yeah, that's another thing over time of a feature of living things is evolution. So biology, we can study at various different levels. So from atoms, even though that's kind of chemistry, everything that's living and everything that's alive and everything that exists basically is made of atoms. And so that's why we can also kind of study biology at the atomic level, because how atoms interact with each other form molecules, and molecules are what make up your cells and important parts of your cells, and organelles. And so the organelles work together to form cells, and then your cells work together to form tissues, and then tissues work together to form organs and organ systems, and that makes up a whole person, one organism. And how organisms interact with other organisms, we would call like populations. And then how populations interact with each other would be like a community. So we can study biology as so many different systems because it all is relevant and it all works together, and there just is more to study at every single one of these levels. So the next highest kind of like division would be an ecosystem. So an ecosystem is a lot of different organisms, a lot of different populations of organisms, and different communities kind of coming together in one area. And then the topmost way that we can study things is the biosphere. So all the ecosystems on Earth and how they kind of affect each other. Biology examines all these different layers and aspects of life. And there's a different name for each of the different subdisciplines that we'll get to in a few slides. Biology is so interesting. If you're not a bio major, I think it's still so interesting and relevant to all of your life, because this is all part of us. So how do we study life? It's really helpful to be able to have a system to organize all the living things into. So when you are studying a new organism, we have to be able to have like a classification system and a way to kind of like label it and categorize it. So right now, the current taxonomic system has 8 levels, and so what that means is that's just like our way of organizing things. You know how in your office they have a certain way to organize things. Scientists have a certain way to organize all the living things. So the biggest grouping that you can put something in is called a domain, and there's only 3 big domains. So if you find like some kind of new organism, you say, okay, so what domain will we put this in? One of these 3 big huge groups called domains, and then within each of those groups there will be smaller groups, and then each one of that will be smaller groups. So the biggest one is domain, the next biggest one is kingdom, and then phylum, class, order, family, genus, and then species. So that's the full like a hierarchy of names and categories that we could put living things into. So for example, if you think of just a dog, there is actually a bunch of different groupings that you have to kind of place a dog in, and then we can get down to the species. So dogs, at first, you would look at their cells and you would say, okay, so these cells have organelles. So it would be within the domain eukarya. So then from there you could say, okay, what do these cells do? Like, how do they get their energy? What are their characteristics? Okay, we could kind of place them in kingdom Animalia. And then these are all the other things that live within kingdom Animalia. So humans are here. And then we kind of have to look within this kingdom, what further grouping? What's the phylum that we could put them in? Okay, they have a backbone, so that means they're phylum Chordata. They're mammals, they're carnivores, and then through going through more and more characteristics, you kind of super fine-tune like which group you have to put it in. So order is Carnivora, family Canidae, so even though this includes other things, we have to get even more specific. So then genus would be Canis, and then the final category is species. So when you see like a scientific name, it's usually 2 words. So for example, this, a dog, Canis lupus. So it's always the genus name and then the species name in italics. So for example, humans, we are Homo sapiens. Our genus is Homo, and then our species is sapiens. Yeah, so that's overall the categorical system. You like have to take something and then look at more and more of the detailed characteristics and see, okay, how do we group this now and now? And that's eventually how you get down to the genus and species name. And I mentioned there are so many different things that are alive that we might not even think of as alive. So of course we think, plants and animals are alive. And these are both in domain eukarya because of characteristics of their cells. We can, first off put it in domain eukarya, and then from there put them in different groups like plants or animals. But other things that we might not think about are alive are also alive, and so they would also follow this category system. So bacteria are alive, and then here would be more these organisms you might not hear about a lot, archaea or archaea, depending on how you pronounce it. They are similar to bacteria, but they're just different enough to be their own thing, categorized differently. So bacteria and archaea are very, very small, simple organisms, and so they are categorized differently in the domain. So domain bacteria and then domain archaea, those are the domains that they are each in. And they are still alive. They have features that, we can now, over time as we studied and discovered them and then studied them more, they are alive, and so they fall under different categories. So this is the overall phylogenetic tree of life. This isn't including everything that's alive. This is kind of just like a big picture summary and big groups to tell you. But the 3 domains are bacteria, archaea, and then eukarya. So those are the domains, the biggest groups I said. So when you first look at a cell, you will think, okay, does it match this? Then it would fall under eukarya. Does it have these things? Then it would fall under bacteria. And then lastly, does it have these things? Then maybe it would fall under archaea. So they are still all alive, and we have to kind of make this tree of life to show the organization and then the relationships to each other. How closely related some things are to each other kind of is demonstrated by looking at the tree and which branches are close to each other. So again, this is not everything that's alive that's included. It's just like big groups that are shown in the names. But these are the big 3 domains of life: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. And then once you get them sorted into one of those, then you can, further classify them. And so, like I said, there are so many different ways that you can study biology. There are different subfields. So molecular biology is like on that studying molecules and how they interact with each other. A little bit higher would be microbiology, so studying microorganisms that are like microscopic. And there's so many different levels. So neurobiology studies the nervous system. Paleontology studies fossils. Zoology studies animals. Botany studies plants. Biotechnology studies biology and kind of the intersection with technology, so how you can use biology and have useful products as it relates to biology. Ecology is the study of interactions of organisms and their environments. And physiology is the study of cells, tissues, and organs. So these are very different fields of study, but they're all basically encompassed within biology. So here's an example of paleontology. They're studying fossils. They're looking for fossils in Spain. Here's an example of molecular biology. So here's a forensic scientist working in DNA extraction for criminal investigations. So there's a lot of different fields. There's so many. And if you are ever interested in, becoming a biology major, and, feel free to talk to me to see, what kind of field would you be interested in? Because there really are so many, and there's so many different paths within biology. So, for example, you can study things like algae or cyanobacteria. You can study kind of the structures that they live in and form by the layering of these things living. You can study E. coli through microbiology. There's so many different things and fields and levels that you can study at. So one thing that does kind of unite all these different fields, though, when you study science and biology, we use the scientific method. And we actually use the scientific method kind of in our daily lives. So I'll give some examples. But the scientific method is a method of research with defined steps that include experiments and careful observation. So I'll get more into the steps, but it's basically performing an experiment and observing the changes that happen and trying to think through, well, what caused those changes? Why did this happen? So when you do an experiment, a hypothesis is something that you could create. It's a suggested explanation for an event, which can be tested. So when you make observations about something in nature, observations usually lead to questions. I wonder how this happens. Why does this happen? Why does this do this? Could this be due to this? So observations about something lead to questions. Questions lead to forming a hypothesis. So you might have that question and then think, maybe it is due to this. I think it could be due to this, or if I change this, then this will happen. So questions lead to forming a hypothesis as a possible answer to those questions. And then you would test that hypothesis to see, is that what ends up happening? So a hypothesis has to be testable to ensure that it is valid. It can't be something that you can't really test. So in the textbook, the example is you can't really have an experiment based on, I mean, it's an interesting question, but if you were to say, do bears have dreams, or what do bears think about? I think bears probably think about that, about fishing or whatever. That is a very interesting question, but it's not something that we really can test. So that would not necessarily be an experiment that you can perform, or does that make sense? So a hypothesis has to be testable to ensure it's valid. And it also has to be falsifiable, meaning it can be disproven. So hypotheses can be wrong or they can be right. So part of science is kind of being okay with being wrong. So you have to have a hypothesis that can be falsifiable and can be proven wrong, and then you just learn from that. Okay, so this is not due to that, like I thought. My plant is not dying because of the water. Yeah, you have to have a hypothesis that is testable and falsifiable. And so when you set up an experiment, you have to have one or more variables and one or more controls. So a variable is any part of the experiment that can vary or change during the experiment. So it's usually something that you change. And a control is part of the experiment that does not change. So I'll give an example on the following slides. So variable is something that can vary or change. A control is part of the experiment that doesn't change. So, for example, this is kind of, relatively simple, but this is like a little girl's science experiment. And she is doing the scientific method. So her question was, does bread mold grow faster on wet bread or dry bread? So this was her question, and her hypothesis was that she thinks that bread will grow faster on wet bread. Mold will grow faster on wet bread. So the variable that she's changing would be whether the bread is wet or dry. She would have a control of dry bread that you're not really changing anything to. And then she would change one thing, and that would be the bread being wet. So that would be the variable, and then the control that you're comparing to that you don't change anything is the dry bread. So that's just kind of like the minimum for an experiment, but there can always be more controls. And yeah, we'll kind of talk more about this in lab, but in any experiment there will be something that you change so that you can see the difference and compare it to the control. And the scientific method is this series of steps. It's making an observation, asking a question, you form a hypothesis, and then you make a prediction, you test this prediction, analyze the results, and your hypothesis can be either supported or not supported. But either way, you report the results. So yeah, sometimes it's okay to be wrong because that's actually how we learn, and that is part of science. So you come up with a hypothesis, and it might not be supported, so then it might lead you with another question. So, maybe I left this bread out too long, or maybe not long enough, so let's try again. So that is more realistic of the scientific method in action. A lot of times it's kind of like just this whole cycle. You kind of have to refine and redo and keep moving and try to figure out, like, okay, so what is it due to? Maybe it was actually this. Maybe I left the bread in the dark versus the light. Like, that's another variable or a control or something that I can do and study next. Yeah. And we actually do this a lot in daily life. So it usually happens when something goes wrong. So you notice something, you make an observation like, oh no, my toaster doesn't toast my bread. Or my favorite example is my car is making a weird noise. Why is that happening? What does this due to? So in this example, my toaster isn't toasting my bread. You're wondering, okay, why doesn't my toaster work? So that's your question. And then you can make a hypothesis. So maybe my toaster isn't working because there's something wrong with the outlet. And you make a prediction based on that. If something's wrong with the outlet, then that means that the coffee maker won't work too because there was something wrong with that same outlet. So say you unplug the toaster and you plug in the coffee maker. If the coffee maker works, then that tells you, okay, it's not the outlet. So in this case, it proved the hypothesis, but then you have to come up with a new one because you're like, well, then why won't my toaster work? So yeah, we do a lot of the scientific method when it comes up when something's wrong. So like I said, oh no, my car is making this like horrible grinding sound. That's going to be a different cause than if it was like a weird whining sound. So even just the sounds, if you make an observation, that can lead you to a hypothesis. Like, okay, that loud grinding sound seems like it could probably be something like the engine. Versus if it was like a squealing sound that only happened when you're braking, that could lead you to a different hypothesis. Oh, I need to like replace my brakes. Right? So then you take it to the mechanic or your family member or whatever. They look at it and then see whether the hypothesis was right or wrong. And if it was wrong, then you just fix the thing that was causing problems. So yeah, we actually do the scientific method like a lot in our daily lives when things go wrong for sure. So in science, when you're doing scientific work and experiments, scientists must share their findings so that other researchers can also find out what they learned about something so that they can also expand and build on their discoveries. So scientists share their findings at scientific meetings or conferences, and also through peer-reviewed articles published in scientific journals. So scientific meetings and conferences happen. There are some that happen like annually, where a specific subdiscipline usually will present all their work. So for example, paleontology, like there will be a conference on paleontology, and all the researchers that study that field can present their findings. Like, I did this, and this is what I found or didn't find, and so we can kind of help each other and collaborate and move the scientific process forward by learning from each other. So that is at scientific conferences, but they also basically do that by publishing their experiments in peer-reviewed articles published in scientific journals. So what that means is that these articles that they write are peer-reviewed, so they're reviewed by other scientists within that field. And it's not just like a peer review like in classes where you just like fix kind of grammatical things and make suggestions. It's a little bit more involved than that. So other scientists will say, you know, you're claiming that this happened, or you set up your experiment this way, and I think that there could still be some holes or some other effects that you might see. Maybe you should redo the experiment this way, like have some more controls so that you can compare. Or maybe change some of the, you have too many variables going on. If you really want to see if it's due to this one cause that produced the effect, then maybe you should make it more refined or change your experiment or present this information better. So peer-reviewed articles by scientists are done by other scientists that usually study kind of really similar topics, and they can tell and help judge whether or not the scientist's work is suitable for publication. So this helps ensure that research that is presented in a paper is original, it's significant, it's logical, and it's thorough. You can't just say, I cured cancer because I drink a beer every day. You can't really say that. Like, you have to be very, very thorough And yeah, so that's part of the job of also being a scientist, is communicating your work and helping each other and collaborating through these processes. So that's all part of, biology and what biologists do and how they study life. And